All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's Wrath of Power. So I wanted to make a video about the use of steroids in bodybuilding and when it began. So I thought this was a very good video topic. I got a request for it the other day, and I thought I would entertain that request with a response. So first, to decide when steroids began, becoming popular and, prominent in bodybuilding, we got to look back at the history of steroid use in general. So we know steroids weren't used before 1849 because in 1849, that was the year that it was discovered what testosterone even was. So how testosterone worked and how the testicles worked and produced testosterone and changed your hormones, that wasn't even discovered until 1849. So there was definitely no steroids before that point because it wasn't even understood how hormones really worked up until then. So the next step would be determining when the first athlete started to use steroids. So we got to look at the history of Major League Baseball for that. So there's a Major League Baseball player named Pud Galvin, and this guy's in the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame. So this guy was the first known athlete to use a type of testosterone or a type of steroid-like compounds. This was known as the Brown-Séquard elixir. So this Brown-Séquard guy, his full name was Charles Edward Brown-Séquard, and he was known for experimenting with hormones. Supposedly, this Brown-Séquard elixir was some sort of testicular extract from guinea pigs or dogs or some other kind of animal, and it was kind of understood what the properties of testosterone did at that point, and that was the intention behind injecting this elixir, was to elevate your testosterone levels and improve your, physical performance. So this was the very, very early days of steroid use. So technically, you could call that one of the first known instances of a steroid use in a sport. So from that point on, the next 2 or 3 decades, really, it was really mainly researched the effects of testosterone and how it worked, and it still wasn't really nailed down until the 1930s. So they knew what Pud Galvin was doing was helping his performance. They knew there was something to this, but really figuring out how this substance worked and this testicular extract worked, it really went on for a couple of decades. They were trying to nail this down. So the key years to consider in steroid use in bodybuilding are really the 1930s. So a lot of the major bodybuilding competitions like the Mr. Universe, the Mr. America, the Mr. Olympia, all started after the 1930s, and the 1930s were really known as the big boom in steroid research because those were the years that the first isolation of an androgenic hormone was really made by a German biochemist, Adolf Butenandt. So once the isolation was able to be done, the 1930s was the year. These were the years that the developments of steroids became a business and pharmacies started mass producing them. So this was the point that steroids were becoming available to consumers. So keep in mind, some of the people who would be looking to consume steroids from the 30s and onward would be bodybuilders. So today in bodybuilding, it's important to make the distinction that bodybuilders use what's known as synthetic testosterone. So this is testosterone that's made in a lab. So up until 1935, the only form of testosterone they had, like I said, was directly extracted from animal testicles, bull testicles, horse testicles, even dog and guinea pig, like I said before. So up until 1935, that was the year they discovered how to make synthetic testosterone. So that's when it really started to boom and the use really started to increase once they had that figured out. So from 1936 onward, there was a man named Charles Kochakian, and this was a guy who basically was a synthetic steroid pioneer. And the focus of his research really focused on how steroids improve, well, specifically testosterone, increases muscle mass. So he did these studies throughout, the 30s and throughout World War II, doing these human studies on soldiers, etc., really trying to figure out how steroids worked in improving muscle mass. So from the mid-30s all the way until 1945, there were a lot of things factoring into the use of testosterone. The prices were getting cheaper. It was becoming more accessible. More companies were starting to produce it, and there was more awareness of the positive effects of using testosterone. So in 1945, there was a book published by Paul de Kruif, and this book was called The Male Hormone, and it basically explained the benefits and the power of testosterone. And this was the book that was really said to begin widespread steroid use in bodybuilding. So first it hit the West Coast bodybuilders in the late 40s, allegedly. And that's when all these bodybuilders really became aware of this substance that was out there, and then it spread amongst the bodybuilding community that, hey, we can use this. It's going to make us bigger. It's going to make us more muscular, and we can train harder. We can train longer, recover better. So that was known to be really the year that steroids took off in bodybuilding, but potentially they could have been used before 1945 by people who were aware, of the benefits of testosterone before it really became widespread. So like I mentioned before, the Mr. America competition started in 1939. The Mr. Universe competition started in 1948. And these are some of the earliest bodybuilding competitions known to man. So really, steroids could have been prominent in bodybuilding from the very first Mr. America competition in 1939. There could have been, the winner of that competition could have been using it. And I know John Gramek, who has won the Mr. Universe, he won the very first, technically the first Mr. Universe in 1948. He's admitted to steroid use. So really, the people who think that before the golden era of bodybuilding, which is considered the 70s, they thought the bodybuilders before that time period were natural, or they weren't using any, they weren't using too much stuff. But the reality is steroids could have been very prominent as early as the late 30s, the early 40s. So really there's probably no clean era in bodybuilding. And then, of course, the first Mr. Olympia wasn't held until 1965. So definitely by that point in time, steroids had become much more prominent. There were gurus at that time like Vince Gironda who were advising their athletes to take things like Dianabol. So it had expanded beyond just testosterone at that point. And Larry Scott has admitted to taking some of these things, and he was the first Mr. Olympia. Now, a lot of people talk about the Soviet Union using steroids on their Olympic athletes, and they think that this was the first instance of steroid use in athletes, but really it wasn't. This wasn't until 1952, between 1952 and 1956. So a lot of people always credit, the Soviet Union as being the first guys that started using steroids. A lot of people probably think that because of the Rocky movie. I think it was Rocky IV, where he fights Ivan Drago. And of course, Ivan is, training in this high-tech facility. He's got people injecting him with stuff. He's got all these leads hooked up to him. Then Rocky's out training in the barn. I think that's probably the imagery that put that, that idea in a lot of people's mind that the Soviet Union they were really the pioneers of, steroid use for athletes. But really, that's not the case. It was much, much earlier than the mid-50s. And then, like I said, later on, things like Dianabol would come into the picture. So Dianabol was allegedly introduced in 1959 by a man by the name of Ziegler. And this guy actually had John Gramek, the Mr. Universe winner, help get people to start taking Dianabol and convince people that this was a good bodybuilding drug. And from that point forward, it was used on the York weightlifting team. Then the use of Dianabol spread rapidly from that point on. So really, that's the main question I wanted to answer is when did bodybuilding really become not clean? And my answer to that question is it probably never was clean, from the standpoint of it could have started as early as the 30s, and the first major bodybuilding shows weren't until 1939. So bodybuilding probably always had a little bit of drug use, in my opinion. There's probably, whether or not it was the early days of testosterone, then they were starting to stack testosterone and Dianabol. I'd say the first instances of people using something, whether it was synthetic test or natural test, it was probably the 30s where that started in bodybuilding, but it really didn't become prominent until 1945, which is still very, very early because that's before the first Mr. Universe competition. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you guys learned something about steroids and bodybuilding that you didn't know before. Please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.